My name is Tal Kitron with Applerouth Tutoring Services. I'm a premium tutor with the company. I've been with the company for about 10 years in various capacities, but now I'm coming to you live from sunny Colorado, where I do mostly PSAT, ACT, and SAT tutoring, and of course, the occasional presentation. Today, we're going to learn a bit about SAT versus ACT and delve into some differences, some similarities, the timelines, as well as expectations of colleges and universities these days. Let me tell you a little bit about our company. And been around for 20 some years, started in Atlanta and has grown a lot. We now work internationally. I have students all over the globe. My personal ethos is to trust my students and to cooperate and collaborate with them to develop a plan and to work together to improve scores and open opportunities. And I think it's emblematic of Applerouth's ethos, which is when you change students' self-beliefs, you change their lives. And I can say that even though the company, as it's grown, I believe that we've really stayed true to this. And what we offer, which we'll talk a bit about at the very end, my goal today is to get you out of here in an hour. We'll leave some time for questions, but Applerouth offers academic tutoring. So that would be in school if someone's struggling with trig or calculus, SAT, PSAT, ACT, which is my bread and butter, as well as executive function coaching. And I'll give you more info about that down the road, but let's get into what we're here for today. The first thing that I really want to do, because I know this is an anxiety-producing process, college applications and testing in general. So one thing to just lay out is test scores do not define you. They are one piece, yes, a big piece, but they're just one piece of the application portfolio. And you can see here, grades in courses, especially core classes and academic rigor generally, is weighted more heavily in a lot of circumstances than test scores. So what good is a test score? It can make up a little bit for a lower GPA or a weaker rest of your portfolio. But again, the point here is just, yes, test scores are important, but they are not the end all be all of applying to college. Into the two tests, the SAT, one of the big differences is it's a much more rigorous reading test. And the tests are changing, but as they are right now, the SAT just has a longer reading section. It's more passages, more questions per passage, more difficult question types, and more difficult material in general. So that's difference number one. The ACT, on the other hand, is a bit more rigorous when it comes to STEM content. And we'll talk about the overlap, which is considerable, but there's a science section on the ACT, which does not exist on SAT. It's not really science. We're interpreting graphs and looking at tables and matching, but it does bring in some biology, chemistry, stuff like that. And then for math, it's 60 questions in 60 minutes on the ACT. So a time crunch, and they want you to know a little bit about everything under the sun, from arithmetic to trigonometry to calculus, brushing up on stats, all this stuff. So SAT, rigorous reading, ACT, rigorous math, that's a very broad brush, but a difference. And a lot of overlap. If you have questions as we go today, feel free to put them in the Q&A function. If it's technical, then our moderator can answer it for you. And otherwise, we'll just save it to the end and I can answer as many as I can when we finish. See, in the ACT, we said science and more advanced math, SAT, more word problems, more reading. But the overlap, I mean, they're both going to test comprehension, grammar. The SAT tests science reading and interpretation on the writing and reading sections, interestingly. Whereas the ACT, like we said, has a full science section. And then both will have some algebra, some stats, bit of geometry. The ACT is heavy geometry with no formulas given. The SAT is light on geometry, but of course they give you the formulas. Structurally, very similar. You can see here both the order of the sections and the timing and breakdown. An experimental section is something most of my students have no idea about, so I would try to warn them before the test. Both SAT and ACT have one. It's section 5. It does not count towards your total score. It's to gather data for future tests. So if you ever are sitting in a test and have a section 5, don't panic. It's not real. The SAT has done away with the essay portion. The ACT still has one, but very, very, very few colleges require it. Like you can count it on 2 hands, the number of schools that require essay on ACT. So I'm able to now tell students when they're registering, usually you can just do without writing, making sure that there isn't a college you're applying to that requires it. But emphasis is off of the SAT, ACT essay and on more to personal statement. You can see it's a long test. This is without extended time. The most common time accommodation for someone who has a 504 plan in school, for example, would be time and a half. So 3 hours becomes more like 4.5 hours approximately. The big difference is that ACT is really a test of speed. It's a time crunch. You can see here how much time per question you get for each test and how the SAT really grants you a lot more per question. A lot of times if it's even, like your baseline scores are pretty close on SAT, ACT, what puts it over the top is people don't like being crunched for time. So SAT is often just the choice based on that. I will say also that if you do get extended time accommodations, it's more of a benefit on ACT in a way because it's such a time crunch. So having that extra little bit of time can make a huge difference. But general rule is you got to move very quickly, especially on the last 2 ACT sections, reading and science. Speaking a bit about math, the SAT has always been, well, not always, but since it's changed in 2015, it's tried to line up with Common Core skills. So a lot more about what people are learning in school. A lot of algebra, algebra 2, zeros and polynomials and factoring and foiling. So if that strikes fear into your heart, then maybe it's, oh, let's look at some of the ACT stuff. The ACT has 60 questions, which vary in difficulty as you go. And so it's really more like, it'll start with arithmetic, it'll be easy. And then later in the test, they'll say, hey, have you ever heard of a matrix? If so, here's a point. Do you know how logarithms work? Here's another point. Whereas the SAT is quite a bit narrower and it's going to be a lot of x-intercept, y-intercept, different things, or same things in a different way. On the SAT, interpreting is favored over solving. So meaning you got to know what you're actually solving for, and then the math is often pretty straightforward. More of an applied math test, meaning there are often variables or real world situations where you have to then plug in and try to make it more of a real life situation to yourself or use numbers instead of words. SAT overlaps in that, like I said, you could see like 4 questions in a row all about the same thing, tested in a different way, but all about like vertex of a parabola. And more reading intensive. So both tests have word problems, but the SAT a little bit harder sometimes to pick out what are they asking. The ACT, on the other hand, doesn't hide the ball. It's more heuristics, rule-based. It tests concepts in isolation. Like I said, like, hey, what's a matrix? Or here's a question about imaginary numbers. Unlike the SAT, you can always use your calculator on ACT, which I think is huge. And they've gotten to the point where they allow almost anything. So not only TI 83, 84, but TI Inspire, as long as it's not one of the ones that's a computer that basically connects to the internet, it's allowed and can do a lot of stuff on ACT and on SAT Section 4. Broader range of concepts as well on ACT, as we mentioned. Finishing up the math comparison, you can see SAT more algebra, less geometry, despite given formulas at the beginning of every section. Trig, mostly an afterthought, just kind of SOHCAHTOA stuff and a few rules. Algebra is dominant. Versus the ACT, you can see quite a bit of geometry. You can see it's more evenly distributed between these 4 things. And again, every test is different. So this isn't gospel, but that's the general rule is algebra on SAT, geometry, ACT is what you can expect to see more of. A few other things just to note on ACT. If you see this stuff and you're like, man, I don't know what any of this is, and it's confusing to me, you know, some of it would be radians and coterminal angles is maybe pre-calc, so maybe people haven't learned it yet. Versus associative and commutative properties are like almost elementary school that we may have learned and forgotten or never learned. It doesn't mean though if these things feel tricky that ACT is not for you. It just means that the last 20 questions of ACT might offer some challenges until you prepare and see a few tests, see a few examples of what they're gonna bring up. But a lot of stuff here from Algebra 2 and pre-calc that you will not see on SAT. So we're going to start to kind of move into the logistics about the process of registering and of taking the tests and applying to schools and how to send scores and all that. So we're going to get into all of it. And if questions come up, feel free to shoot them my way. You want to try both tests ideally first. So like one thing you can do is take mock tests. You can do it on your own. Applerouth offers a couple easy ways to do it. And let's say we take the tests and you get a slightly higher score on the ACT mock. If there are no other variables, start with ACT. You start with your best score. If the scores, if you take a mock test of each and you look at the results, you're like, oh, these are pretty even. Time wasn't an issue. I just kind of had even scores on both. Then go with what you like better. We'll do better with what we like. So if you're thinking, well, yeah, I really like this kind of algebra heavy nature of SAT, do that. If you're thinking, man, that SAT reading was hard, I'd rather go quickly for easier stuff, then maybe it's ACT. Rarely, because you do want to focus on one test once you choose. So you want to try both, but choose one and focus on it. Rarely, if down the road you see that preparation is not yielding results you want, you've taken one or two official tests already, then we can switch. That usually comes into play because of schedule constraints more than anything. If you do need to switch, it's not an end of the world. It's a bit of a setback, but more than 80% of the content from SAT would transfer over to ACT and vice versa. So it's okay to switch, even if not preferred. In that quest to figure out which test you're taking and doing those practice ACTs and SATs, that's how we settle on the best tests, and do that first. You can use your PSAT score, which even though it's out of 1520, they say is scaled the same as SAT out of 1600. The Applerouth website, again, and several places online can help you concord your ACT scores to the SAT scale. So like knowing that a 30 on the ACT is like a 1360 on the SAT or something like that. Again, if you're clearly stronger on one test, that's like 50, 60, 70 point difference on SAT or equivalent or more. Use that test, go with your strength. If the score difference is negligible, so I would always in a first session look at the scores with a student and say, okay, well, they're pretty even. Do you have a preference? And if no preference, you go with the stronger test or whatever official test dates line up well with the schedule. But when in doubt, go with what you like. Go with what felt better. Because the test prep journey is usually at least a couple months, if not 2 to 5 months. The reason for that is because you should really plan on taking 3 tests if you can. I would say there are a decent amount of students who can get away with 2. Very rare to be one and done. It also puts undue pressure. So if you think, oh, I'm going to take this test, I'm going to get my score I need and I'm done. The problem with that is then it puts pressure on you, makes people anxious. Whereas if you've got a couple tests down the road, even if you don't end up taking them, but you know you've got these options that you're registered for, it takes pressure off. I also just see gains going through the second and third tests. So we'll talk about super scoring later and why this is important, but plan on 2 official tests, if not 3, and aim for them to be clustered close together. So like if your school offers an April school day test, take that and the April ACT, or take that and the May SAT, right? That's something that a lot of people don't take advantage of, but if you can do a school day test and an official test back to back, that's wonderful. Or if not, do like May and June, or do September, October ACT is what I'm preparing for a lot of students for right now. There are a lot of myths and conspiracies about the SAT and ACT. So I remember when I started tutoring, there was a myth that I think it was the October test is bad. Stay away from October because the curve is nasty. But there's just no evidence for that. You can see the numbers here, but it just varies from year to year. There's no consistent trend. There's not a test date where like all of the ringers are taking it. So it's all just standardized based on the curve of those who took it on that test date. And the tests are similar enough and consistent enough that you're not going to see a big shift from March to October to December. So don't factor that into choosing which test to take. More do what's my school schedule and extracurricular schedule look like. Some elements to successful prep, what we're all about. So one is definitely mock tests. I mean, early and often, I don't think you want to overdo it, because the big key for a practice test and homework is you got to make sure you learn from it. A mock test is borderline useless if you just take it, look at the score, and move on. And I think that's the tendency that a lot of us have. Really, it's look at the mock test and then work through every question you missed or struggled with, so that when you see it down the road or something like it, you know what to expect, you know how to do it, you've made this mistake already and learn from it. Distributed practice, meaning don't cram. This is not your typical test that you can just like learn the night before. I don't think that rarely works, of course, but some better than others. And a lot of us in high school develop that, I guess, tendency to procrastinate. The SAT is big, even as you go from week to week. Don't wait till the night before a tutoring session to do all your practice. Do 20, 30 minutes a day, keep it light, even 30 minutes every other day. You can get a ton done. And so just spacing things out and leading up to the tests kind of even keeled. Starting early, we'll talk about that too. That can strike fear because some people are thinking, well, I'm a rising senior, I'm not early. You still have time, it's okay. The earlier you can start, the better. But of course, there are different timelines. Other elements are how much time do we spend on task, that's in session, on your own, and practice tests. Finishing strong is something that we work on by just working backwards from a test date. So if you're testing on SAT August 27th, then we'll work backwards, making sure we meet on the 23rd and the 16th and the 9th, so that we've got 3 solid weeks of prep going in, right? And so we don't want gaps in those few weeks right before the test. And you can use collegeboard.org, which is the SAT website, or Naviance to calibrate your goals. I think what's best is take a baseline test and then prepare a little bit, take a second one. That's when you can really get a sense of what's realistic and what your goal is. So I'm big on setting goals high, but make sure we're realistic and not just pie in the sky. Now, some of this presentation it's a lot to pack in. I think that we've done a really good job with these slides, but I want you to know that this testing plan we're going to talk through is going to be highly simplified just by nature. If we have questions at the end, we can try to flesh it out a bit. And of course, there's plenty of people at the office who would be happy to answer questions as well. So a big thing to consider, and maybe the first thing after the mock test, is which test should I target? And so this is kind of the last bit about the test registration itself, and then we'll get into applications. But every test is offered either 6 or 7 times in a year if you're in the US. And for right now, these are the months that they'll be offered. The stars are important test dates. So you can see it right here in October for SAT and also March and May. Those are the only 3 SAT dates where when your scores come back, which is usually like 10 to 14 days later, you can actually access all the questions you missed online. So you can just click a hyperlink and see the question you missed on the real test. Really tremendous resource. The ACT also offers that, a test information release, and that's in December and April and June, but it's not quite as useful because it's not released online, it's mailed. So if you take the April test, you'll get the mailed copy back barely before June. Still helpful, but not quite as easy. Most of these registration deadlines are about a month in advance of the test date, but you want to sign up early because, especially like I have a lot of students in Seattle, and it's notorious for SAT testing centers filling up like well in advance. So I have students who are flying to California or driving to Idaho and going to Montana, like going literally different states to take tests. If you can sign up early, you may be able to avoid that issue. You can get a test center close to you. So that's done on collegeboard.org or SAT.org for the SAT, and then ACT.org for ACT. Talk a little bit about SAT breakdown, since we got into ACT a bit. Some changes. So SAT subject tests were very big when I was in high school decades ago, and they were for college credit. It was kind of like a supplement to APs, just another feather in the cap that you can take and just say, okay, this again puts me at a little bit of a higher level than this person next to me. They did away with it, which is good, because I think APs and subject tests were a bit redundant. And AP exams, the AP craziness, as most people know, is ever present. So SAT subject tests are no more as of a couple of years ago. And the SAT essay, the writing portion, is no more as well. So 2 things that I was never too fond of, now done away with. There's a lot of information that's recently come out about the digital SAT. And so this is a big, big change that's coming down the pike. It will affect anyone who's in 10th grade or beyond. Right now, it won't affect, but current 9th graders will be affected by this. Biggest thing, it's going to be shorter, 2 hours instead of 3. It's also going to be on a computer. That's a big difference. More time per question. It's also going to be, I don't think this is on this page, but what we recently learned is that the passages will get harder as they go, depending on how you do. So the first test will be easy, and it'll actually be adaptive. So if you are doing really well with the math, your next section is going to be quite a bit harder. Versus if it's a struggle, then you'll see an easier section compared to other students. So it'll be interesting to see how they standardize and curve all of that. It's possible that students will see the same test questions, but in different orders. So yeah, that'll be fun to flesh out. The passages will be shorter, but wider range of topics, oftentimes only 1 or 2 questions per passage. And they're doing away with some of the nuisancey stuff. Like you can use the calculator throughout the whole test. So there's no no-calc section. There still will be free response grid-ins, and actually it sounds like maybe more of those, and they'll be sprinkled throughout the test. Top score in SAT still be 1,600. So it went 2,400 for a bit, but now 1,600 since 2015, and will stay that way. And because it'll be on computer lab, or in computer labs on computers, and it's just a little bit more flexible in general, you're going to see a lot more school day testing, which is something that some students are able to take for free, depending on what state you're in your school. And if you're ever offered a free SAT or ACT in school, it's usually a really good idea to take it because it's a nice kind of leisurely, not leisurely, but friendly environment. You can take it just during a school day. So this is big, big changes, but again, won't affect you unless you're just a freshman. What's happening with the ACT is a great, great question. Nobody knows. Major ACT changes, as you see in bold, there have been majorly delayed. They said computer-based testing a long time ago, and they actually did make the change internationally. So all my students who are international taking the ACT for quite a while now have taken it on a computer. Totally different look. And some of the strategies, of course, change because you can't mark up a passage with a pencil. We have to learn how to use the online tools. The bigger thing I think that was promised was sectional testing, which was really exciting because it would allow students to take just the English section or just a math section on a Saturday. So if you take a ACT and you have 1 or 2 sections you really didn't feel good about or weren't as good of scores, then you could just take the math and super score it on your previous test. We'll talk more about the scoring, but I mean, if and when that happens, it's going to be a game changer. And it'll make scores more competitive because people will be able to just hone in on only one thing. Say, all right, I'm just prepping for science and just going to do that this time. Anyone's guess as to when it'll come. I haven't heard much rumbling on it recently. So as soon as they can roll it out, I'm sure they will. I mentioned super scores a couple times. Both SAT and ACT offer the option. Not all colleges do what's called super scoring. But as an example, I took the SAT twice, and I didn't know tutoring was the thing. I wish I had. But the first time I got a 710, 710. So that's verbal and math. The next time I actually did quite a bit better on verbal, but I had a bad math tip. And so here I'm thinking, well, shit, I got a 1420 again, and that's frustrating. But most of the colleges that I applied to super scored, which means that if I submitted multiple tests, they would only see the highest section scores from across multiple sittings. So these schools didn't even know I took it twice. All they knew is, oh, this guy's applying with a 1480, which of course is more competitive for a lot of schools than 1420. The ACT has really championed super scoring, and they've got 4 sections, so 4 different scores, so it's more important in that regard. They've also now made it easier to report. So it used to be that if you had, like, let's say you took this test again and went down on math, but up on science, up on English, and down on reading. It used to be you'd have to submit this, like the April 19th, September 18th, and whatever these were. But now the ACT website will automatically super score it for you. And for colleges that accept super scoring in their application or in their admissions, you can just send your super score as opposed to multiple tests. The way to send test scores, you can see here, you can do it online on the ACT website. You can actually usually register for a couple before you take a test. The risk being you don't know your score yet. So most people wait till the scores come back and then spend a nominal amount to submit the scores to schools. You can do it separately from the application. So again, we'll get into more of that. It's a lot of info, but short story is the more times you take the test, the better crack you have at a better super score, which can impact your admissions portfolio for a lot of colleges. want to talk about something that's really taken the world by storm, pun intended, which is the test optional tsunami of late. When the pandemic started really affecting people's lives and becoming prevalent, vast majority of colleges just switched their admissions to test optional. And at Applerouth, we weren't really sure what it would mean. For a little bit, I was intrigued. I was interested in what they're going to do, but a little bit concerned about, well, are we still going to need SAT tutoring? Short answer is yes. The 4 different types of policies are required, optional, flexible, and blind. By far right now, test optional is the most common policy, by far. That being said, so again, 2 years ago, 80% or more changed to test optional. It's starting now to come back to some schools and states requiring tests. So I know we've got a lot of folks, Applerouth folks in Georgia, and like UGA is going to come back to test required already. North Carolina said they were, but now it's going to be delayed a little bit more. Florida, University of Florida, and the Florida schools are now test required. So to apply to University of Florida, you actually have to take SAT or ACT like it was 4 years ago, but not like it was 2 years ago. And this has been pretty interesting, the way it's impacted applications and admissions. So we're going to talk quite a bit about that. These highly selective schools are also rumored to be coming back to test required. So we definitely may see that schools are going to follow the lead of schools like this. And so we're going to talk a bit about what does test optional even mean. And I actually have a lot of even acquaintances asking me about that. If you have not submitted SAT or ACT scores, a college will still consider your application complete. So let's say you send with the Common App, which if you don't know what it is, I'm sure you'll find out soon. Or let's say you just apply to University of Miami. Even if you have just submitted like all of the questions and your essay, personal statement and recommendations and whatever else that they've asked for you, work experience and transcript and all that stuff, if you haven't yet sent them ACT or SAT scores, it's still at a test optional school, it's still complete. And then it's your option whether to send a score and add to it. And so you can just do that. You can take a test and say, oh, it's a good enough score, I want to add it. And if it has a test score on the application, the college will look at the scores. But then, of course, if they get an application without, that's in a different pool. And so those people are going to be weighted more heavily on extracurriculars, grades, personal statement. Right now, test optional is a dominant position, but what it really just means is more applicants, and it means different pools, one for test takers with scores and one for those who are submitting without. So how does that work? Right now, more than 3/4 of all US colleges and universities are test optional, over 1,800 schools, way more than about 1,000 that were test optional before. And especially when like the schools that we hear more about. So like the Ivy Leagues, but even like Big Ten and SEC and ACC schools, a lot of those schools were not in the mix of the 1,000 that were test optional, and now they are. And that's for better and for worse. I think that it's going to stay that way. We're, have at some point return to some semblance of normalcy. And as that happens, it will likely remain the same position. Even though as some schools come back to requiring SAT, ACT, test optional, I think is still going to be dominant. At the moment, only 5% of schools on the Common App, which I mentioned, require testing. So you can see that we mentioned Georgetown and the Georgia and Florida schools, plus military academies. That doesn't necessarily mean that these schools are so rigorous on test scores, although I know Georgia, I'm sure Georgetown is, Georgia Tech. But what it really just means is that I think they're trying to bring down the number of applicants, honestly, because one of the big things that happened when they switched to optional is there were just more people applying because, well, I didn't have a shot at Stanford, but now I can go test optional and maybe my resume is good enough. So more people applying to more elite schools. Some more data. Estimates are within 3 to 5 years, and anyone's guess really, but 3 to 5 years, they thought that 20 to 30% of schools would be test required, 60 to 70% optional, 5 to 10% test blind, which we'll talk about, but meaning that like you can't submit a score. it seems now with how slowly people are going back to test required, 20 to 30% required might be too high. Maybe it's more like 15 to 20% max. Most schools are going to continue to be test optional. We'll get into what that means in a moment, but yes, so most colleges holding the line, conditions are still kind of shaky, not much data out there, and the stuff that is can be unreliable. So we're seeing more applications. The question is, what's going to happen the last couple of years, next 2 years, as far as these people who submitted applications without tests? Were they more prepared for college? Were their graduation rates higher or lower? How did the GPA end up as compared to those who did submit? So there's going to be a lot of cool data, and I don't really know how it's going to go. I think probably some of it will cut each way. The reason they're not deciding is most colleges want to wait. They want to defer and see several years of data, so maybe 3, 4 more years, who knows? And admissions officers just want to see what is the new normal, if there is one, what test submission rates look like. So meaning what percentage of people applying are submitting scores, just what does that look like before they make anything set in stone. Up County in the South, meaning there are more schools down here that still require testing. So if you are a person who's thinking, you try the standardized test, they're not for you, or you just don't feel like your scores will be up to par, then don't want to count on these schools, because they've often not only continued to require test scores, but they tie them to admissions and also scholarships. Georgia Tech's Rick Clark, who I think we quote later, he said that other state systems in the South also have a good chance of reinstating. So we've got North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, but it's likely that some of those other ones, Alabama, Mississippi, who knows, like LSU probably, like those schools also might do that. Of course, Harvard is always a school that people have an eye on. For the next several cycles, they've already said they're going to stay test optional. Harvard has. They want to get a full class and just look for performance across those who did submit tests and those who didn't. And I think many colleges, because it's Harvard, will follow that lead. So again, this is just a lot of ways to say it's going to be like this for a while. There's some uncertainty, but this is status quo for the time being. It's test optional is the dominant position. The Supreme Court ruling recently on affirmative action may eliminate testing requirements. That's interesting. There have been some rumblings of new tests, like the University of California system worked on a new test for a while. I think that what they're saying here is just that there may be some burdens to requiring tests, just because it may not be, the court may rule it's not constitutionally allowed. If you can't factor in race or ethnicity in a meaningful way, then to require those tests is an issue. Colleges are being a little bit, I guess, not shady, but clandestine about their data as far as how many test scores or how many people are they admitting with scores, how many without. So we don't know that much, but I will say that test optional admissions gives colleges cover. So maybe there's just someone who their story is really interesting. They're from a different country and they've got this great background. And now that test scores in that pool may not be an issue, that person may be more likely to get in. I think all of this is pretty nebulous. As we know it right now, ACT, PSAT, SAT aren't changing, but the actual requirements of colleges requiring applicants to take it, I think that those days are probably mostly past, except for maybe in the South. And again, test optional doesn't need test compliance. This is really crucial. And this is why, even despite kind of some concerns that, oh man, test optional, are people still going to need to tutor and take tests? The answer has been a resounding yes. Most students still submit test scores, and honestly, some of them now are stronger because it's a bit more competitive. And colleges that are test optional do still have this bigger pool of students who are applying, and they'll consider those results among factors that help predict whether the student will succeed. So test optional is like, okay, you can still apply without a test, but you should still try and see if you can get one that qualifies you as a good candidate, and we'll explore what that means. Some changes. So you can see here, 2021, 2022, a few schools that went test blind. I think Washington State's one of the bigger ones there, Caltech, good school. And then there are a few that have just shifted to permanent. So like I said, the UC system, they're always trying new things, but I don't know how they are doing with their new standardized testing plan. I think that kind of has fallen apart a bit. So we'll see what they end up doing. But these schools are looking for different ways to standardize. It's tough. And the SAT and ACT are imperfect and really maybe not the ideal way to test readiness for college. Like we said, only one part of many things, but they're on a curve and they help you differentiate between a 3.0 at this school and a 3.0 in this school on the other side of the country. So you can see some schools have gone test blind, but it's not a whole lot. We mentioned some of this, but a lot of schools consider test scores an allocation of merit-based aid, and not submitting scores can affect that. So like looking at Alabama as an example. You can see here, these scholarships are tied directly to ACT score. If you don't have an ACT score above 27, you can't qualify for any of them, or an SAT score above 1260. But then if you can get a really solid score, you can see a lot of money potentially coming from that. So these are like the presidential scholarship is basically a full ride, very close to it. So you can see though, at U of Alabama, for example, you would have to have a test score to receive one of those merit scholarships. A few other schools like that. Utah State, as an example, will recommend students submit test scores for automatic awards that are guaranteed if you have this level of GPA and the ACT score above 23. Texas Tech, same thing. So like high school rank plus test scores, you can get up to $9,000 for merit as a freshman. And then Lake Forest College, again, kind of like Utah State, you got a 3.0 and this score level, then you can get automatic merit scholarships. So that would actually be a pretty compelling reason to submit a score. I see questions coming in, which is great. We'll get to all those at the end. Zell Miller, this was a big one when I was in Georgia. So Zell Miller and Hope, it's a little bit harder to get, I think, than it used to. Both of them are, because I think it used some of this you could get like a 3.0, I want to say, or 3.5 back in the day. Now you got to have a minimum 3.7, pretty high SAT or ACT scores. That would be like 70th percentile or more. And then in college, you have to also maintain that GPA of 3.3 or above to remain eligible for the scholarship. Now, I will say, yes, 1,226 are great scores, but it's not like perfect level. It's not 90th percentile or 99th. So those are really big scholarships that Georgia folks can get with a solid, very good, but not like phenomenal ACT or SAT score. I mentioned this too, but going test optional just made application numbers fly through the roof at most selective schools. And you know, the joke at Stanford is they're trying to get down to 0% admission, and they have more applicants than ever. And they've got, again, a pool of those who are submitting with PSAT or with SAT, ACT scores, and a pool of those without. And then they're going to sift through and select some from each. But application numbers have gone up through the pandemic. Part of the reason is I think that the colleges also are uncertain about like who should they offer, because usually they'll offer a bunch more students than they expect to accept, but it's harder to predict that now. So who is going to actually accept and come to school here? Because of that, we've seen a lot more wait lists, which is a pain in the butt. So longer wait lists, more wait lists, but also people coming off of wait lists, which has been nice. So it's not like if you get on a wait list for a school, it doesn't mean you haven't gotten in. It means they're pretty uncertain and it may change. Early decision is replacing early action as a tool. So yeah, I think early decision is a major predictor of who's going to come, meaning you've decided, I want to go to this school. I'm applying super early because if I get in, I've committed. So I think that's becoming more popular. It's desirable for colleges in and away for students because you've got these potentially multiple rounds of applications, but at least you can get into this really early first round so the school knows you're prioritizing them. And I think that then you know early on, right, if this is who you want, you can get in. So I think it brings the timeline way up for people, makes you start early. We'll talk a bit more about early decision, but it is one of those things that's really becoming a big factor. So deciding like August, September already of senior year, what school you're going to, as opposed to applying in October, November, and waiting a few more months. So admission rates are down because the applicant pool went up. So you can see here from 2021, 2019, all these schools, MIT, Emory, Duke, UGA, UVA, they all became more selective. Part of that, again, just more applicants. And as I said, early decision looming larger than ever. I mean, look at some of these schools and how much of their class they filled with early decision applicants. So before even the regular round of applications goes out, Penn, Brown, Emory are already half full. Tulane, Dartmouth, Rice, like half full. Duke, half full or half empty if you're one of the people who hasn't applied yet. So that's really significant. That's a huge, huge change. And it is a bit stressful, but I do think talking to a college counselor about early decision, and if there's a school that you have your heart set on, it's really something worth considering. Taking the test early and applying early decision. Cornell recently clarified that if you do submit an application without a test score, you'll be subject to heightened scrutiny standards, meaning we just care more if you don't submit a test. Naturally, we care more about GPA, academic rigor, your extracurriculars and your background, other testing that you've taken, APs, essays, recommendations. All that stuff is heightened and more important simply because they don't have the test score to standardize. So it's nice that they've at least admitted that and kind of said that out loud. Applicants are up, but test submitters are down, which is not shocking. What you're seeing is students who are taking the tests and some who either don't have the time or energy to really put in a lot of work, or they're not getting the scores they want to see, and so they pivot to test optional. You can see here, STEM is one of the big differences. So STEM schools, STEM-focused schools still want test scores. And because of that, we've seen more male students percentage-wise than female students submitting scores via Common App. But that's not that significant of a number, I don't think. I think the big one is just we've got 77% of users to 48% of Common App. I mean, that's a big drop. So a lot of people are applying without scores. Even though they're still important, it does give you a different avenue. And strategic submission, meaning I'm going to send this score to one school, but not to another, or maybe this school I won't send scores to at all. Only 4% of students were doing that in like 2019. And then by 2020 cycle, almost a quarter of students were choosing to submit to some and not to others. So maybe, hey, this score is good enough, it's going to make me feel really good about University of Florida, but it's not good enough for me to feel really good about Princeton. So I'll send it to Florida, but I'll go in the different pool for Princeton. Be more strategic. And here, just a little more data about submission rates to big institutions, big schools. So you can see here, submission rates, excuse me, in the low to mid 60s for non-first generation students. And that's just a change from 2019 to 2020. So pretty big drops in both the private and public sphere, especially private. And so again, this is about how many people submitted SAT scores versus how many didn't. So a vast percentage fewer submitted test scores in 2020. Big differences by major. So this is just data from one public university. And you can see that in engineering, 75% of applicants submitted SAT or ACT scores. Business applicants, 55%, but then education, social work, general, fewer because it wasn't as important. STEM students want to showcase the quantitative abilities via ACT, SAT. So it differs by major, something to factor in. So some questions to answer now. Did test score submitters have an edge? I mean, that's a big question. Colleges are being, like I said, kind of clandestine about this data, these data, because it makes people really look closely. But the short answer is it seems like probably if you submit a test score, you are more likely to get in. You can see these numbers at Emory, Tech, Vanderbilt, UVA. 13% of people at University of Virginia who didn't submit tests got in versus 25% of people who did. You can see that percent advantage. 120% at Georgia Tech is really significant. That means just a really big disadvantage, honestly, at the front end if you don't submit scores because there are fewer applicants who get in. So again, these data are a little bit old now, a little bit dated, but it does indicate that test scores are still important. Which brings us to the question, should I try the tests? And the answer is yeah. I mean, get baseline tests in. before making any decisions at all. I do that a lot with students. Applerouth can help. We'll talk about our practice test weekend coming up at the end of this month. If you take a baseline test and you think, oh man, these scores are close to what my college wants, what these schools I'm looking at want, then yeah, probably prep for the tests. That might be a good idea. If you're like not in the ballpark and you're thinking, well, I want to go to these schools, but I'm not close to the range and I don't think I can get these test scores up, or I don't want to spend my time on that, then maybe you invest your energy elsewhere. And that's a totally respectable decision and a good decision for some people. Next is, should I send in my test scores? So let's say we take the official test, we get them back, and then it's a decision of, do I send it to each school or some schools? Well, that brings questions of, are they going to add value? And do you want the admissions office to see your scores? That's what it comes down to. So a few opinions on this and a little bit more data. So here it's, the quote is, one public university dean I talked with showed me admissions rates that were remarkably similar between those with and without test scores, except in STEM and business, where students with test scores got in at much higher rates. So anecdotal evidence that STEM and business are going to be more competitive when it comes to submitting test scores, and we should submit for those. There's also a floor below which we should not submit. So Sean Felton says, if I were pressed to give a threshold, I'd say 650 or higher, meaning if you have a 650 on verbal or 650 on math or higher, submit. But then you look at the range, and I wonder if maybe he's being a little bit generous, right? If he weren't pressed to give a threshold, maybe he wouldn't have. And if the middle 50th percentiles, so 25th to 75th percentile of students who got in are in this range of 680 to 760, I'd want to be at least on the low end of that range of 680, probably, and then 720 to 800 for math. Then again, that's where it's a close call. So it's like, if you're right at the cusp, that's a decision with the counselor or tutor or parents to decide, maybe even an admissions office, you call them and decide, should I submit this or not? You can see the different colleges within Cornell, there's a lot of variations. So don't take this as gospel, but a 650 would fall in the bottom quartile, meaning there 75% of students who are admitted have higher scores than that, at least. If you are a fine arts or classical music major, then test scores probably won't have as much weight. So below the average probably wouldn't hurt. It still would be a decision on if it's test optional, should I send it or not? But major makes a difference. Rick Clark, we mentioned earlier, if a student has a test score in the upper 50% of the prior year's range, and we can even go back a couple of years because the data aren't great now, he says send it, it won't hurt you. So if you're above 50% of the people who are admitted, and this is very easily available online, just Google University of Washington SAT percentiles. If you're in the lower 50%, it definitely depends. If you feel like, well, something here, like let's say you want to do STEM and your math score is super high, send it. But then if it's in the bottom quartile, lowest 25%, probably not. Go with your strengths, right? These are all just logical decisions, but it does demystify what I think is a stressful and complex process. GPA also factors in. Most people have grades that align with their testing, and that's my experience too, but not always. My test scores were better than my grades, I think. And if you have great grades but average scores, it might actually weaken your profile because you're looking like this rock star, and then it's, the SAT doesn't quite line up. If you have the test scores well below your grades, you definitely don't want to submit them because it's more like, well, let me just hide this part. And if you have a great test scores that are better than your grades, then it can make up for lower grades. It can help your admissions status and chances. Kind of touched on this, but let's say your composite score is in the third quartile. So like, let's say maybe you're on the fence of whether to send your composite score. But if you have an 800 math and you're applying to engineering, then yeah, you should probably submit those scores, even though the verbal is low. If that was flipped, you're not submitting your 600 math because that could be a red flag for an engineering program. So not all 1400s are created equal. And again, this is a bit scary, so don't put too much emphasis on it, but a weak test score becomes part of the conversation. So if you go way below the range of a college, or just it's lower than most people getting in, it can be a red flag because people are thinking, why they send this, and do I need to be looking out for other stuff? So if you have the option and it's test optional and you have scores you don't want to send, even if you have some you do and some you don't, or none, Don't submit a weak score knowing that it'll weaken your application, but that's again common sense. Every school is different as well. So if you're on the Common App, you don't want to list the scores unless you want to every college you're applying to on Common App to see it. You don't have to submit to everyone or withhold to everyone. So like if it feels like this school I have a good chance at, I'm going to submit, but this is a reach school, my scores aren't good enough, maybe not. So every school is different. And just a few minutes here on a few kind of case studies. So take a look here. An example for Swarthmore, where you can see like these middle ranges of verbal is 680 to 750, meaning half of people who got into Swarthmore in like 2020 had scores in that range. Half of people, the 25th to 75th percentile, had math scores from 700 to 900. And so the question for you is, you can just go in and say like, okay, let me put in my scores and see how it stacks up. I think this is a screenshot of just the Applerouth website. So like a student would see this on their page. And mock scores and real scores, you can kind of see where you stack up to these quartiles. If you're in the bottom quartile, we'd say probably not. Less than 1380 is a probable no. 25th to 50th percentile, I would say most college counselors would tell you no these days, but it's definitely a gray area. And certainly there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. And if you're in the second or top quartile, you should probably submit. It's going to help your status. It's going to make you an attractive candidate, and they're going to want to bring you to the school to boost their own numbers. Ranges for the past couple of years could be skewed because there were some non-test score submitters. So the score ranges have gone up because the lower scores are no longer being submitted. So to know what the competitive score is for school, you might have to go back a little bit. But then again, some schools are doubling down on these higher ranges. So it's a bit tough. I would say err on the careful side. So if you think, man, my score is like really close on the border, I would actually just call the admissions office and see if you can get someone on the phone and just ask them, or talk to counselors and fellow students and contacts to see what they think. Just make a comprehensive decision. But yeah, score ranges have shifted. Georgia's kind of a tough example, but you can see like the middle quartiles, the middle 50th percentile now, like has shifted just a ton in the past 2 years. So up 100 some points on SAT and like 5 to 3 points on ACT. So that's a big change. And mostly because there are some students who were submitting test optional, but also just becoming very competitive. Boston University, you can see a few others here that have just really competitive now. I mean, middle 50 percentile is 34-ish, 35 on ACT, or the range is 30 to 35. That's high scores. Question now is a 34 on ACT good enough for Penn? And the answer is, I don't know, right? So like if you get a 33, should you submit it now for Penn? And the answer might be no, which is kind of insane, but those are the tough decisions people need to make now. It's like you pretty much need to be near perfect for a school like that if you are submitting your score. And if you're not, you're in with a different pool of people. All right, getting towards the end here, you can see just a few more. Yale hasn't released the data yet, but you've got pre and post-pandemic, and just the middle ranges of all these schools on average has gone up like 30 some SAT points for both the low end and the high end. So instead of 1320 to 1460, we're now talking 1360 to 1500. So quite a few big changes. Back to the original screen of what Applerouth has to offer. I'll leave this up for just a moment, and then we're going to do questions and answers. And I want to tell you just about a few things that Applerouth has coming up. Feel free to stay for the question and answer portion, or you can also leave if you've gotten what you need. A couple of big things. One is that our National Practice Test Weekend, July Jumpstart, is coming up at the end of this month. There are online in-person options for mock tests. So in-person will be Atlanta, DC, Seattle. We have offices there, and people can take mock tests in person. There are also strategy sessions starting on July 19th. If you visit applerouth.com/July Jumpstart, or just visit the main website, you'll see more info there. And summer's always a good time to start. You don't have to, even if you're like a rising junior and it's early, for example, you don't have to commit to starting. You can just take a test or two and have those scores as a baseline for when you do start, or even just for knowledge for yourself, right? There's no pressure. And then we've also got this mental health webinar series. So I know that Jed Applerouth himself has done some of these, but coming up, we've got practical tips for parents. When it comes to technology, we've got teens and friends and social emotional skills, and then anxiety, which of course is a big part of all of our lives and a big part of tutoring. And then something that's really exciting that I'm actually going to learn more about, maybe get involved with, is Applerouth Writing Workshop. So grades 5 to 12, tutor our assignments manager, who is really thoughtful and selects tutors based on the student's description and questionnaire and needs, and then the tutor's experience. And so you get a hand-selected tutor, 5-part curriculum on your pace, your schedule, recommendation of 5 hours, so 1 hour sessions, but that's flexible. And I just think very cool resource. We've got a bunch of tutors who I think are really made for this. And so you can contact Applerouth and speak with a program advisor to get started with that. And numbers below, here's the phone number, here's the email. And we've got just a few minutes here, so I'll just quickly answer a couple questions. I'm not the best test taker, but I have a pretty good GPA. Which test would be better for me? I really think you want to take both. Take an ACT and SAT and just compare it. That's really the broad brush answer. Take a baseline SAT and ACT and compare your scores. Do you have to do the essay portion and ACT? The answer is no. And the negative for not doing the writing portion is very slim to none because so few colleges require it. I would say it's almost dead, the writing portion for ACT. And I have in the past not felt confident saying this, but now I do, that you could take the ACT without the writing portion and feel secure in that. All right, Applerouth. Oh, okay. So I think that one of these, we're gonna have our moderator answer. And a good, thank you, Perry. North Carolina's are test optional for this fall because they delayed it a couple of years. So you're right. They've said they're gonna change it, but not until like 2023, 2024. So North Carolina University is still test optional, unlike some of the Georgia and Florida schools. How many times can you take the SAT? As many times as you want. I would say after 3 or 4 times, you will probably see diminishing returns. But I would aim for 3 tests total, but you can take SAT and ACT as many times as you want. No limits, and then just decide whether to submit scores or not. But yeah, I would say any more than 4 times is probably overkill. All right, couple more. I believe there will be a recording of this presentation. I would say reach out to info@applerouth.com if you'd like a copy, and I'm sure that you can get one. So a couple people asked that. Last 2 questions. One is, should students practice and get to know the test structure before taking baseline tests? I would almost say no. I would say go in blind and just take the mock tests. And then what I usually do is in my first session with a student, if we haven't decided yet, we'll go over both tests, work through results together, and then decide on which one to pursue and make a schedule. So I wouldn't prepare before the mock SAT or ACT. I would just take them and then use those to inform your preparation for the real tests. One question I don't have an answer for is, are students getting out of their early decision agreement? Is it becoming more common? The lawyer in me is curious. I don't know, but I would guess probably it is becoming more common to get out. I think it's pretty hard though. It's hard to get out of an early decision commitment. All right, last question is, if a college doesn't super score and your scores are uneven or split, do you send like high math, low verbal? Do you send both? The answer is yes. So if you get a 600 one time on math, but then 800, and then you flip them, send both scores, because colleges that super score will just see both. If they don't super score, then that's a harder decision and depends on the program, the school. So that's a tougher decision. And last but not least, if you submit a score and it's not the greatest, will lower your chances? It might. That's why it's such a tough decision. So I think about it, look online at quartiles, and then people at Applerouth will answer. Even if you're not doing tutoring, if you have questions, reach out. Hopefully this was helpful. We're at an hour, so let's call it a night. Thank you for joining, and hope you guys have a great evening.